Hello everyone. In this chapter overview video, we're going to take a look at activity-based costing. So we're going to look at only two learning objectives here. The first is to review using a predetermined overhead allocation rate. And the second is how we use activity-based costing, which uses multiple rates instead of one rate to allocate indirect costs. Remember that in the last chapter, we used a predetermined overhead rate to allocate our indirect costs to products. And we do this at the beginning of the period because remember, companies need to know how much a product costs them so they know how much to charge their customers. They can't wait until the end of the period in order to get the actual numbers, so we use estimated numbers. The predetermined overhead rate is calculated as you see, which is total estimated overhead costs divided by the total estimated allocation base for the year. Once you have that, your allocated cost is equal to your predetermined overhead rate times the actual quantity of allocation base used. Now let's take a look at an example. If you're in my class, this is on the handout that's in the class, and if you're not, you can find this handout in the comments section below. So a company manufactures two types of handmade backpacks, the standard and the custom. And let's look at this information we have here. So we have the number of units produced for each, 10,000 standard, 2,500 custom. We have direct materials per unit, $12 for standard, $25 for custom. And finally, we have our direct labor hour per unit, direct labor cost per unit, which is $10 for standard and $30 for custom. Our total estimated overhead for the company is $122,500 and total estimated labor hours are $87.50. Now remember, our goal is to find the cost per unit, and the cost per unit is made up of direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. So we have our materials and labor numbers here, and now we need to find our overhead. So we're going to calculate our predetermined overhead rate, which is the total estimated overhead of $122,500 divided by the total estimated direct labor hours of $87.50. And that gives us $14 per direct labor hour. Now, if we want to find out the total overhead applied to standard and to custom products, we're going to take this $14 per hour and we're going to use it down here. So remember, our total labor hours for standard is we're making 10,000 units of product, and each one uses 0.5 hours per unit. So we're using a total of 5,000 hours times our $14 per direct labor hour, and that gives us a total of $70,000 overhead allocated to all of the standard products. Then for custom, we have 2,500 units of finished product times an hour and a half per unit gives us 37.50 hours. Again, multiplied by the 14, and we get 52,500. Now we want to know cost per unit, so let's put that together. So remember that we knew our materials and labor. We have these numbers here, and we're going to take the $14 per hour and multiply that by the number of direct labor hours per unit to get our cost per unit. So standard uses a half hour, 0.5. We're going to multiply that by the 14 to get 7. Then we're going to add these three up and we're going to get $29 in total cost per unit. The custom is going to be an hour and a half per unit, 1.5 times the 14 gives us $21, and when we add those three up, we get a total cost of $76 per unit. So these are the numbers the company would use to set selling prices. Now let's take a look at activity-based costing. It's not really too scary. It's basically you're doing the same thing that we just did, only instead of one allocation rate, you're going to have multiple allocation rates. And the rates are based upon usage of activities. So the company puts the costs together into what they call activity cost pools. So they add up all of the costs associated with particular activities, such as purchasing or machine setup. We're going to go through 4 steps in order to find the allocation rates to use in order to cost the products. So first thing the company is going to do is identify the different activities and their allocation bases. Sometimes these are called the cost drivers, the base. Then we find the total estimated cost for each activity. Now, if you're in a class, this is all done for you, right? And then you're going to find the total estimated volume for each activity's allocation base. And then finally, we calculate a rate for each of the activities. All right, so let's take a look at an example of activity-based costing. So the company did some analysis and they came up with 3 different activities that happen in production: setup, assembly, and quality testing. And they came up with the costs. So this is steps 1 and 2 to remind you. So that's finding the activities and the total cost for each activity. Next, we're going to find the total estimated volume. So there are their costs. Notice that the total overhead is still $122,500. Now we need to figure out, well, how much of each allocation base is used by each of the products. So setup is driven by, the cost of setup is driven by the number of batches. That's the allocation base. And here are the number of batches used. Assembly is driven by the number of direct labor hours, and here are the labor hours used, which we had from before. And finally, quality testing is based upon the number of tests, and here are the number of tests done for each of the products. Here are the totals, and these are the numbers that we're going to use to calculate our allocation rate. So we need these in order to do some allocation later, but for this, to calculate the rates, we use the totals of all of the different products. Now, the last thing we're going to do is to calculate the allocation rate for each of the activities. So remember, our total estimated cost for setup was $30,000. And we had 3,000 batches in total. I'm going to go back here 1 minute to remind you. So we had 3,000 batches. We're using these total numbers. So we're going to divide the 30,000 by the 3,000 batches, and that gives us $10 per batch. For assembly, we divide the 70,000 by the 8750, and we get $8 per direct labor hour. And finally, for quality testing, we divide and we get $2 per test. Notice that you have these per test, per direct labor hour, per batch. These are important because you need to say what the allocation base is, because remember, before we only had direct labor hours, but now we have batches and tests. So now we're going to calculate how much overhead is applied to each of the products. So we're going to take these rates and we're going to multiply them by the amount used for each product, just like we did before. So for standard, we have 500 batches, and our rate is $10 per batch, and that's going to give us $5,000. And our custom was 2,500 batches, so that gives us $25,000. For assembly, we had 5,000 direct labor hours at $8 per hour, and that gives us $40,000. Now remember, this is the cost of assembly. This is not the cost of direct labor, so that's why this is our assembly rate per hour, okay? And here we have 3,700 direct labor hours at $8 per hour, which gives us $30,000. Now for quality testing, we had 3,250 tests for standard at $2 a test. That gives us $6,500. And our custom was 8,000 tests at $2 per test, which gives us $16,000. Now we're going to add up all of our costs, and we get total overhead for standard of $51,500. We're producing 10,000 units of standard, so our cost per unit turns out to be $5.15, dividing 51.5 by 10,000 to get our cost per unit. Now for custom, our total cost is $71,000, and we are making 2,500 units of the custom. So that gives us a total cost of $28.40. So we're going to take these overhead costs now, and we're going to add them to direct materials and direct labor to get our total cost per unit. And it's going to be a little different than before because remember, we're using a different allocation base. So take the 515 and the 28.40, and those go forward. Here they are here. So now we have our materials and labor, same as before, and we have our overhead using activity-based costing this time. So notice that our total costs per unit are a little bit different. Our standard was 29 before, and now it's only 27.10. Our custom was 76 before, and now it's 83.40. So even though we are making the same products and have the same costs, you can see that using the different methods could result in different costs per unit for planning purposes. So that's all we have for this. I think you are now ready to work on your chapter materials. Happy studying. See you in the next video.